Lamar again, 35b1. We are at the top of Lamed Hey Amud Beis. We are going to be analyzing.
For Litvak, this is very.
This is not okay. Well, this is not Hasidish versus not Hasidish. Derech Hashem is pretty, this is not Hasidish, just Kabbalistic. Okay, 35b1. Let's see. Lamed Hey Amud Beis. We're at the top of the page. We are going to analyze the Mishnah, small piece after small piece. So if you recall, the Mishnah said, Yotzei. We read at the top of the page. Yotzei b'demai b'maiser, that a person can fulfill their obligation with matzah from demai and maiser. What is demai? Demai is rabbinically prohibited food because demai actually is made up of two words. Da means this. Mai, what is it? In other words, it's food which we're not 100% confident that Meiser was taken off because we're buying it from someone who isn't 100% trustworthy, but it's a rabbinic restriction. In other words, if someone says, if someone invites you to the house and they say it's kosher, you're allowed to trust them, right? So, in other words, there is this basic trust you're allowed to have, unless you know otherwise. Again, if you know definitively otherwise. So, demai it's something you're not 100% sure that it is okay because of the person that you're buying it from. Maybe they took tithes, maybe they didn't take the meiseros, maybe they did. But rabbinically, there is a prohibition. Okay, so the Mishnah asks, demai ha lo chazile. Since it's not fit for the person to eat, how does the Mishnah say that I could fulfill my obligation of eating matzah by eating matzah that's demai? If it's not fit, as we're going to see soon, there's a pasuk that's going to tell us, if it is something which you're in violation of a prohibition, you're not supposed to be eating, then you can't fulfill your mitzvah of matzah. So why you fulfill your obligations? The Gemara says, Kivan dibai mafkir lenechse. Since a person could theoretically renounce ownership of all of your property, you could right now go ahead and say, I renounce ownership of all my property. You could do that, and if you would do so, havi ani bo'chal demai, you would actually be treated halachically as someone who is poor. And if you are poor, if you have no money, then you're allowed to eat demai. Okay, and then hashadami chazile. Therefore, since in theory you could go ahead and relinquish ownership to all your property, and since in theory that you're allowed to do so, which would enable you to eat demai, therefore that means you have the capacity to eat this, and therefore even if you don't go ahead and relinquish all your ownership, you are allowed to fulfill your obligation with eating demai. The point that the Gemara is trying to make is that at least at least biblically, this is food which there'd be no issue eating, since you have the capacity to eat it. At least if you were to go, make some choices, go ahead and relinquish your ownership. Therefore, biblically, you'll be allowed to eat this food, and therefore, even though you shouldn't do it, you should not be eating demai. Demai is only made. Demai is not set for people to eat, but since you could theoretically do it, therefore it's fit to be eaten, and therefore at least you fulfill your obligation. Now the Mishnah elaborates on this elsewhere. The Mishnah says, "Machil asaniyim demai." You're allowed to feed poor people demai. Someone comes to your door and they say, "Hey, I'm really hungry," and the only food you have is demai. Okay, so you're allowed to give them demai. It's okay. Vesachsani demai. And also you have Jewish soldiers who are traveling. You have these soldiers traveling from place to place, and they need food. They're like they're poor because they don't have any food. They're dependent on the host city to feed them. So you're also allowed to feed them. But Rav Huna, Tana was taught in a brisa. Beis Shammai omrim ein machilin asanim demai. Beis Shammai says you do not feed poor people demai. Vesachsani demai. You do not feed traveling soldiers demai. Beis Hillel omrim machilin. You're allowed to feed them. Okay, so basically our Mishnah follows the opinion of Beis Hillel. It says that since it can be given to the poor, and since you, no matter how much money you have, could become like you're poor even momentarily by relinquishing your ownership to everything, therefore demai is something which could be eaten, and therefore you fulfill your obligation. Okay, Mishnah continues. Next quote from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that you're allowed to fulfill your obligation with matzah from Meiser Rishon, whose truma was separated. Okay, so what is again, let's review. Well, the way it works, you harvest your farm. You all have farms for a second, right? You have your farm, you give truma gedola to the Kohen, okay? You give a small amount to the Kohen, and then what you have left, you take 10% from you have left, and that goes to the Levi. And then the Levi, and that second thing is called Meiser Rishon, and the Levi has to give truma, he has to give a portion of his the 10% he received to the Kohen, right? So again, the Israel, when I first harvest everything, I give a percentage to the Kohen, and then I give 10% of what's left to the Levi. The Levi then gives, and that's called Meiser Rishon, and then the Levi gives a portion of what he took, what he received, he gives a portion to the Kohen. So the Gemara asks, what's the novelty in the Mishnah? The Mishnah said that if it's Meiser Rishon, meaning what belongs to Levi, and he took off Meiser and he took off Truma, then it goes. Then you're allowed to make matzah with it. Of course, you could fulfill your mitzvah of matzah. You did everything right. Like what's the novelty? So when it says Pshita, since the Levi took the Truma from his Meiser Rishon, Chulanave, the food that's left over is completely mutter food. In other words, not only is it eaten by the Levi, by the way, once the Levi receives the 10% and then he gives the Kohen, that food that he has is actually able to be eaten by everyone. What's the novelty. The Gemara says, Lo tricha, shekdimo b'shibalim. We're talking about a case, and we saw this a couple of times throughout Shabbos and Eruvin, where the person goes ahead and takes the Meiser Rishon a little bit early. In other words, the mitzvah to give to the Kohen is only so after it is, the end of the harvesting. So you cut down the sheaves, and then you all the different steps. So then basically it's till it's everything's smooth and piled up nicely. That's when the obligation to take off Truma begins. But let's say you're in the middle of harvesting, or you come to the Levi comes to your field, he sees you harvesting, it's I'm going to take my 10% now. He could technically do that. And bypass, he gains a little bit, right? Because if I first give the truma to the Kohen, let's say I had 100 sheaves or whatever, I give to the Kohen. So I give the Kohen 1 sheaf. Now I have 99 left. Then I give 10% to the Levi. He gets 9.9. But let's say you come earlier, right, and take before it gets removed, he gets 10 because he took 10% from what's there before. So he could technically do that. Okay, so Shekdim Mishibalim, he goes and he takes the Meiser Rishon before the grain was still in the ears before it was properly harvested. V'nilei ben Trumas Meiser, and then he took from his 10% he gave to the Kohen. V'lo the ben Truma Gedola, but the first original Truma, that what's called Truma Gedola, was never separated from it. 35b2. Ezra Ravo teaches us. What's Ravo? We're going to say now. Ravo Amr Shimon ben Lakish Meiser Rishon Shekdim Vashibalim. Let's say a person has Meiser Rishon, again, the Levi's portion, which was separated while the grain was still in the ears, before it was properly harvested, fully harvested. Patrim Truma Gedola, you are exempt from that Kohen's portion, the Truma Gedola. Shnemer, as it says, very most of Mena Trumas Hashem, Ma'aser Mina Meiser. You should separate from the food you have, Meiser, a portion from the Meiser, 10% from the 10% you received. Meiser mina Meiser marti lecha v'lo truma gedolo trumas Meiser mina Meiser. The Levi, if the Levi took his 10%, he's only obligated to give once. He's only obligated to give 10%, and we could completely bypass that original amount that's supposed to be given to the Kohen. That's what the pasuk teach me, that I take a 10% from the 10% he receives, but that's it, and then you're done. Enough to give that original truma gedola, the original portion was supposed to go to the Kohen, completely bypassed. So Ravo is learning from the pasuk that you could bypass this process. Amle Rapapa Abaye, Rapapa says to Abaye, wait, Elmeata, afilu hikdimim b'chuin ami lepater. So why are you telling me it's only when, only if he does this early, only if he comes along and he takes it while it's still, before it's all piled up nicely? What if he comes and he does it even after it's piled up nicely? The pasuk says that when the Levi receives his portion, all you have to do is he takes 10% from the 10%, right? He gets his Meiser Rishon, and then he gives 10% to the Kohen. And he never has, and it says he doesn't have to give more than once. So why are you limiting it to specifically before it gets piled up? Just say, and at any point, if the Levi takes his 10%, then he's able to bypass the Truma Gedola entirely. So Amalei Alecha Makra, the pasuk says, to answer your question, Mikol Matnosechem Terimu Es Kol Trumas Hashem. There's an extra pasuk that says from all your gift portions, you should separate Hashem's Truma. So there is a pasuk that implies that there's a time when there's an extra Truma that's given, implying that sometimes the Levi is going to give, in addition to his regular 10% that he gives, he's going to give an additional truma. Okay, meaning he's going to go have to make it up to the Kohen because the Kohen missed his truma gedola, that first original portion, and then sometimes not. Ask the Gemara, Mara Isa. So how do you know when to apply the pasuk? In other words, yes, one pasuk implies he only gives 10%. The Levi only gives 10% from his 10% and never more. And there's another pasuk that implies he gives more. So how do you know to apply it? Hi idgan v'hilo idgan. The pasuk that talks about truma says the first of your grain, dagan. And so we learn from there, and so we learn from there that when it's dagan, when it's grain, when it's processed, dagan means processed, finished grain. When it's processed, finished grain, that's when the obligation to give to the Kohen begins. From the first piling, meaning once it's piled up properly, then you have a full-fledged obligation to give to the Kohen before giving to the Levi. And if you gave to the Levi would have to make up for what was already obligated to him. But before it's called Dagan, the obligation to give to the Kohen, the original Meiser Gedola, the first Truma Gedola, the first giving to the Kohen, that did not kick in yet. So again, let's just quickly summarize. There is a way of since the pasuk says you have to give from the dagan, from the processed grain, you have to give to the Kohen truma. Okay, so what that means is that either I, the Yisrael, the farmer, I have to give to the Kohen, and if I didn't, and I gave to Levi first, the Levi has to make up for what was taken because something was missing from the process. Because once it was dagan, once it was processed grain, you have to give meiser to the Kohen. You have to give, truma to the Kohen. And therefore, if I give 10% to the Levi after it was already processed, then he has to go and make up for what was not given originally. However, there's another pasuk that says that the Levi only gives 10%. So what does that apply to? If he took before it was dagan, if he took before it was already made into processed grain, then he only has to give 10%. He doesn't have to make up for what was missing, what was bypassed. Good, and so that's what again. So going back to our Mishnah, what the Mishnah was saying that the person, that a person is allowed to fulfill their obligation with matzah that was made from Meiser Rishon that the truma was taken from. The Gemara said that's obvious. So we're saying it's not so obvious because we're talking about a case where a person did a little bit of a shtick where it wasn't done properly. Meaning, of course, in a situation where the Kohen first gets his portion and then the Levi gets his portion and then the Levi gave away his portion to the next portion to the Kohen. Of course, it's good. We're talking about a case where the Levi bypassed the system. The Kohen got a little ripped off. Nonetheless, you're still able to fulfill your obligation. Let's go for it. We did, yes. This came up a couple of times. Yes. Okay. Good call. Meiser Sheni v'Hekdesh Sheniftu. Okay, the next case of the Mishnah was Meiser Sheni. Again, Meiser Sheni is the portion that you take and then you bring to Yerushalayim and eat in Yerushalayim. And so what we do, sometimes a person, let's say a person has like, I don't know, a huge amount of produce they're going to bring from Meiser Sheni. And I say it's a big schlep, right? I'm taking a flight from Tveria to Yerushalayim. It's too much to carry in my carry-on. So what they do is they say, okay, it's $100 worth. Great. $100 worth put onto my $100 worth of coins. And then I just take the coins. A lot easier to travel with than $100 worth of produce or hektish. Let's say a person consecrates this table to the base of Mikdash, and they're like, what? I'm going to schlep this to Yerushalayim? No way. So what I do is I say, okay, this table is worth $45. I go and I put transfer $45 worth of value onto these $45 worth of money, and then I travel with that to Yerushalayim. So the pasuk says, so the Mishnah said that if a person goes ahead and makes matzah with Meiser Sheni produce. Okay, so it was grain that was Meiser Sheni, but it was redeemed. Or hektish, let's say a person sanctified he designated his grain for the base of Mikdash, and then redeemed it, then you're able to make matzah with it. The Gemara says, of course, like that's what happens. When the table or the grain, when I transfer the sanctity onto the money, it no longer has sanctity. Of course I can use it for matzah. So Gemara says, so Meiser Sheni v'Hekdesh Sheniftu pshita, it's obvious. So whenever I make such a transfer, let's say I had $100 worth of grain that belongs to Meiser Sheni, or a person consecrates $100 worth of grain to the base of Mikdash. Then I go and I say, you know what? I want to move the holiness, the sanctity from the grain onto money, right? So no problem. I could do that. The thing is, I have to add a fifth to when I do that transfer. It's not appropriate to just do a transfer straight up between the sanctified, the Meiser Sheni produce. Again, if I have $100 worth of produce, so when I transfer it onto money, I have to add a fifth. That has to be a little bit more because it's not appropriate to just go and do an equal transfer. And so that's the halacha. So Gemara says the person over here only had the exact amount. He didn't add the fifth. The novelty is to say that even though he did something wrong, he should have added the fifth. It doesn't impact the transfer. He did something wrong. In other words, if I try to transfer the holiness of, I have $100 worth of hektish and I try to transfer it into $90 worth of money, it doesn't work. It has to be obviously the same amount. But in a situation where I do $100 and I didn't add the fifth, it still works even though I did something wrong. And that's novelty. The fifth is not essential and doesn't prevent the redemption from taking effect. Okay, the Mishnah continued and said the Kohanim are allowed to fill their obligation with matzah made from challah or from truma. So again, Jesse, if I give Jesse grain as truma, he could go ahead and make matzah with that truma. The Gemara says, Pshita, why wouldn't you be able to do so? Madatema, I would have thought matzah shavel chal adam inak. I would have thought the matzah has to be eaten by everyone, right? Imagine if we were to do that, then that means if I were to go to Jesse's house for Pesach, if he were to invite me, that'd be very nice, then I would not be able to eat the matzah, right? Only Jesse would be able to eat the matzah because it's Kohen food. You would have thought that matzah has to be fit for everyone. Kamashwan, matzos riba. The Torah says the word matzos many times to teach me that even if the matzah is only fit for some people to eat, i.e. Kohanim, it's still okay. I can make matzah with truma, and as long as the person eating it is allowed to eat it, no problem. Okay, says the Gemara. Further, another line from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said of lo b'tevel that you can't fulfill your obligation with tevel. Tevel again is food which none of the meisters were taken from. Pshita, that's obvious. Since tevel cannot be eaten, of course you can't make matzah with it. Lo tricha b'tevel tova midrabanan shezar b'atan she'eno nakov. We're talking about tevel, which is only rabbinic tevel. Okay, so what that means is as follows. Normally, for something to be tevel is if I grew something on the ground and then I harvested that, I have to give all the meisters. I have to give all the tithes from the food. But let's say I planted something on the ground in a flower pot, and the pot did not have a hole in it. Okay? So is it part of the ground? No, yes, maybe, no. So rabbinically, we consider part of the ground, even though it's not really part of the ground, right? Because it's not attached to the ground. It's a flower pot with no hole in it. So there, it is tevel, but only rabbinically. So the novelty is, in such a case, even though it's only rabbinically forbidden, I still can't make matzah with it. Okay, it says Gemara, Velo b'maiser rishon shelo nitzru trumaso. The Mishnah continued and said they cannot fulfill your obligation with matzah from maiser rishon whose truma was not separated, meaning I give the 10% to the Levi, and the Levi does not take his portion and give to the Kohen. Pshita, the Gemara says it's obvious. Lo tzricha shekim makri. So no, we're talking about a case. This is going to be like the inverse of what we saw above, where the Levi went and took the Meiser Rishon ahead of the Truma Gedola after it was a finished pile. Ma'adatema, I would have thought, Amar Alei or Papa Labaye, like remember Papa said to Abaye, wait, since the pasuk says that the Levi never has to give more than one Meiser, maybe even if he would take his Meiser, his 10% after it was already piled up and made into grain, maybe then also it would be okay. Kamash Malan Kiddushani Le. The answer, the pushback is no, that's not true. If he took it once it was already made into grain, once it was piled up, then it is not valid, and therefore that matzah cannot be eaten. The Mishnah continues, Meiser Sheni v'Hektish lo niftu. Also, with Meiser Sheni or consecrated property that was not redeemed, Shita. If let's say you have Meiser Sheni grain and you didn't redeem it, of course it can't be used for matzah. L'olam's niftu. The Gemara says no. Really, we're talking about a case of niftu. It was redeemed. U'ma'ala niftu. What does it mean? It wasn't redeemed. Shel niftu kehilchasan. It wasn't redeemed properly. What does that mean? Meiser rishon shebdol agavi asimon. The Meiser rishon was redeemed on an unminted slug. Okay, what does that mean? You shall bind it in money. Davar sheyesh lo tsura, and we learn from the word v'tzarta that it has to be on a coin that has an image. Okay, back in the day, if you keep in mind, they had there's a lot of coins in distribution, right? And basically, like it's not a wealthy society, and basically you had coins that had like the image, that had the picture. You had Bar Kokhba, you had the Roman Emperor, whatever it was, and then you had coins which basically completely rubbed out, which are not as significant, but they're coins. They were still used. You'd have to borrow like, oh, how much is this coin worth? It's kind of like rubbed out. Okay, it's still a coin. It's metal, right? So basically, it's going to use this bartering. So the Torah says vitzarta comes from the word tsura. It has to be like a good coin. It has to be a coin with a form on it. If it's a rubbed out coin, unminted slug, that's not going to be work. That doesn't really work. So when the Mishnah said that the Meiser Sheni wasn't redeemed, of course it was redeemed, but it was redeemed improperly, and since it was redeemed improperly, it was put onto a bad coin, the Meiser Sheni is still going to have its sanctity, and therefore you cannot use that to make matzah. The hektish chilo gabi karka, and when you redeemed the hektish, the consecrated produce, you redeemed it onto property, which doesn't work. 35b4, the Torah says that when it comes to consecrated stuff, if you want to redeem it, you have to put it onto items, and then you pick it up. But teaching that it has to be done onto items, meaning if I sanctify something, if I go ahead and I designate this to hektish, and then I want to redeem it because I really want to learn my Derech Hashem, and I don't want to give it to the Beis Hamikdash, so I have to transfer the holiness onto another object, movable object. But if I go ahead, because the pasuk says I put it onto this movable object, they come low, and then I take it with me. But if I go and I transfer the holiness onto a piece of land, it doesn't work because I can't pick that piece of land up, and that's what we're talking about. A person who went ahead and transferred the sanctity onto a piece of land, and therefore that transfer is not a good transfer. Okay, now the last thing we're going to do, God willing, tomorrow is we'll discuss why the matzah has to be something which there's no other prohibitions around, but we'll come back to that, God willing, tomorrow. Have a great day.